My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 27 years old, and tonight, I'm standing alone at the Mercy Children's Gala, frozen. As my stepmother points toward me and laughs, she must be one of the servers. Security starts walking over. My stepsister is filming. No one in the room knows I'm married. No one knows my husband is the private billionaire funding the entire event. Years of being overlooked, erased, and replaced are about to come full circle. In the quietest, sharpest way possible. If you've ever stood in a room full of family and still felt invisible, let me know where you're watching from. Drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe for more stories about family drama and dignity reclaimed. To understand how I ended up here, being humiliated at a gala I indirectly paid for, we need to go back to where it started. I was born into the kind of family where things just made sense. My father built a name in finance. My mother built the world we lived in. Together, they made our home feel steady, predictable, even beautiful. My father, Robert Whitmore, founded Whitmore and Associates, an investment firm with quiet influence across Chicago. He was deliberate and composed, a man who spoke carefully and shook hands with conviction. But it was my mother, Eliza, who gave our house its warmth. She was grace in motion, someone who remembered birthdays, cooked without recipes, and laughed in a way that made other people want to stay longer. The early years felt like being wrapped in soft light. My mother picked me up from school in the same wool coat every fall, the scent of cinnamon gum on her breath. I remember weekend picnics in Lincoln Park, rainy afternoons curled up in the den, her humming while folding laundry. Quiet rhythms that made me believe life was soft, kind, and predictable. I didn't know it then, but we were living in a season that wouldn't last. She found the lump in late spring. By June, the words aggressive breast cancer were being whispered behind closed doors. She tried to shield me from the fear, but even at 8 years old, I could feel the house tilting. In less than 6 months, she was gone. I wore navy to her funeral because she'd once told me black washed me out. I remember that more than I remember the service itself. After that, silence moved in. My father didn't know how to hold space for grief. He buried himself in work, earlier mornings, later nights, endless meetings. The man who once brought home flowers on random Tuesdays now moved through the house like a guest. At first, he said it was temporary, but time passed, and he stayed gone, even when he was home. In his place came a rotation of nannies. Some were kind in a distant way, others meticulous but cold. They followed routines, drop-offs, meals, bedtimes. But none of them knew the way my mother had peeled apples for me, or how I liked to sleep with the hallway light on. I became quiet, careful not to need too much. I taught myself to read the moods of adults. I stopped asking if he'd be home for dinner. Grief didn't arrive like a wave. It settled like dust, slowly, quietly, covering everything. The piano in the living room stayed closed. Her garden wilted from neglect. My drawings stopped being displayed on the fridge. I would sit by the window, sketching the city skyline with a pencil too short to hold properly, hoping he'd notice. He didn't, but I still believed he would. At that age, children assume love is inevitable. I didn't know yet that sometimes people disappear not because they stop loving you, but because they don't know how to face what's broken. I didn't know this was only the beginning, that someone new would enter our lives, not to help us remember her, but to quietly erase her place in it. It started, as most changes do, with a smile at a fundraiser. My father met Vanessa Carrington at a charity event hosted by one of his longtime clients. She was elegant, poised, with eyes that didn't blink too long and stories that always landed just right. A widow, like him, raising her daughter alone. Juliet was my age, with perfect posture and piano recital ribbons that trailed like streamers. I remember the first time we met. Vanessa knelt to my eye level and told me I had a very thoughtful face. At 10, I wanted to believe that meant something. Within a year, they were married. No big wedding, just a small ceremony in Lake Geneva that I wasn't invited to. Vanessa and Juliet moved into our house that summer. My bedroom stayed the same, or so I thought. Until one afternoon, I came home from art camp to find my belongings rearranged into the smaller room down the hall. Juliet now had mine. When I asked my father why, he hesitated, then said the new room had better light for painting. That wasn't true. Juliet didn't paint. I did. At first, the shifts were small enough to ignore. Juliet received the bigger slice of cake. Juliet was allowed to stay up later. Juliet's needs were always urgent. Mine could wait. At Christmas, she got riding boots, a new phone, and a weekend trip to Aspen with her mother. I got a sketch pad and a polite thank you note tucked into a gift bag that still had the store tag inside. My father smiled and asked if I liked it. I told him I did. Vanessa never yelled. She didn't need to. Her words were careful, always wrapped in concern. Claire, sweetheart, can you use the guest bathroom? Juliet needs a little more privacy these days. We're going to hold off on those art supplies this month. Juliet's writing lessons are getting more expensive. Her voice never raised. But the message was always the same: your needs come second. At school, I learned to say no thank you when friends invited me over. Juliet had first pick of the car, and Vanessa preferred if the driver wasn't making 2 stops for teenage whims. I started walking more. I read during lunch. I stopped asking for rides, for new clothes, for anything. The hardest part wasn't the imbalance. It was watching my father slip further away. He had always been busy, but now he was unreachable. Vanessa began managing our calendar, always with a smile. Family dinners were scheduled when she knew I had debate club or an art showing, and when I couldn't attend. She tilted her head and sighed. Robert, I'm doing everything I can. But she resists. I've tried. Once. I overheard them in the kitchen. Her voice lowered into that practiced sorrow. She won't let me in. I wish she would. I really do. My father didn't say much, just rested his hand on hers and nodded like a man too tired to question anything. That night, I stayed in my room while the 3 of them watched a movie in the den. I could hear Juliet laughing. My father's voice, lighter than it had been in months. I sat on my bed, holding a charcoal sketch I'd drawn of my mother. The lines smudged where my fingers had pressed too hard. Vanessa never spoke ill of my mother. She never had to. She just rearranged the house, shifted the stories, and slowly replaced every picture with new ones. Photos of Juliet on horseback, family portraits in matching tones, images where I was either absent or cropped out. She never told me I didn't belong. She simply treated me as if I didn't. By the time I turned 13, I had learned not to take up space. I knew how to answer in half sentences, how to avoid eye contact at the dinner table, how to excuse myself from family vacations to focus on school. My name wasn't spoken unless something needed fixing. I didn't realize it then, but Vanessa wasn't just building a new version of our family. She was rebranding it, and in her version, I wasn't a daughter. I was a complication, one she intended to quietly edit out. I was 19 when the call came. A Friday morning in late August, my second week of college. I had just settled into my dorm at Northwestern, still figuring out which coffee shop opened earliest and how to keep my roommate from borrowing my art supplies without asking. My phone buzzed during an intro to psychology lecture. It was Vanessa. Her voice was flat. Claire, it's your father. He collapsed at the office this morning. They think it was a heart attack. There was no tremble, no break in her tone, just information, delivered like a calendar update. I remember asking if he was okay, though somewhere deep inside, I already knew. She paused. He's gone. I don't remember how I left the classroom. I don't remember the cab ride to the hospital or the blur of faces in the waiting room. By the time I arrived, it was over. I hadn't even had a chance to say goodbye. The funeral was polished. Vanessa handled everything with the same controlled elegance she brought to every fundraiser and holiday party. Black lace dress, pearl earrings, tearless composure. Juliet clung to her arm like a grieving daughter should. I stood near the back, beside a row of floral arrangements with cards I didn't recognize. My name wasn't mentioned in the eulogy. Neither was my mother's. In the days that followed, the house felt less like home than ever before. My room, what was left of it, had been turned into a guest space. Most of my childhood drawings had vanished, replaced by framed certificates bearing Juliet's name. No one asked if I was eating, sleeping, or even okay. Vanessa moved with mechanical grace, as if grief were just another task to manage. Juliet wandered the house in silk robes, taking phone calls from friends who couldn't believe how sudden it was. Then came the reading of the will. We gathered in the office of my father's longtime attorney, a man with a trimmed beard and voice like sandpaper. He read from the folder in front of him with practiced neutrality, but each line chipped away at something I didn't realize I'd been clinging to. The majority of my father's estate, properties, investments, and personal assets were left to Vanessa. Juliet, though not his biological child, received 2 trust funds and full ownership of a lake house in Michigan. I was left with a modest education grant and a fixed stipend to support independent transition into adulthood. The amount would barely cover my living expenses for 1 year after graduation. I sat frozen, barely hearing the rest. My father, who used to brush paint out of my hair and tell me I had my mother's hands, had written me out. Whether it was his true intention or Vanessa's persuasion, I didn't know, and that uncertainty was its own kind of grief. Outside the attorney's office, I asked Vanessa why. Why had he left me so little? So decisively, she didn't look surprised. Your father believed in the value of hard work, she said, voice even. He wanted you to build something on your own. Claire, Juliet, well, her needs are different. She offered a small, practiced smile. The kind that pretends to be kind. I'm sure you understand. I didn't. Not then. Maybe not even now. A week later, she called me into what used to be our family kitchen. The countertops were different, granite now, colder. The walls no longer held any of my mother's paintings. Vanessa folded her hands and said, "It's time you started thinking about your own space. This house? It belongs to a new chapter." She didn't say it with malice. She said it with certainty, as if it were a fact too obvious to question. I packed in silence. Old sketchbooks, photos my mother had hidden in a drawer, a half-burned candle from my nightstand. Juliet passed by the door at one point, her expression unreadable. "Don't worry about Thanksgiving," she said lightly. "Our traditions are shifting anyway." And just like that, I was no longer part of the Whitmore household, not disowned, not banished, just erased. I left the Whitmore house with 2 suitcases, a stack of sketchbooks, and no one waving goodbye. There was no dramatic confrontation, no slamming doors or shouted regrets, just silence, and the quiet sound of a cab pulling away from the curb. I didn't cry, not then. I had cried enough already, in the years that led up to that moment. I moved to Oak Park, a neighborhood just outside Chicago, where the rent was still manageable and the trees turned gold in the fall. I found a small studio apartment above a bookstore. The floors creaked, the radiator hissed in winter, and the window overlooked an alley instead of a skyline. But it was mine. I painted the walls a soft gray, hung one of my mother's old scarves near the door, and called it home. I found a job at Whitestone Gallery, a boutique space that specialized in emerging artists and community workshops. It didn't pay much, but it gave me purpose. I cataloged new pieces, helped plan exhibits, and spent hours talking to artists who were just as invisible as I'd once felt. They came with stories of loss, of hope, of rebuilding, and in their work, I recognized my own reflection. I didn't ask anyone for help, not my father's former colleagues, not family friends who now pretend not to see me at public events, not Vanessa, who sent a stiff email once a year with an attached holiday card, photos of her, Juliet, and whatever curated perfection they were presenting that season. I never replied. Independence became more than survival. It became my boundary. I paid my bills on time, skipped dinners to make rent, bought secondhand furniture, and learned how to patch things before replacing them. I stopped expecting applause, stopped explaining myself. The people who cared didn't need explanations. The people who didn't, I owed them nothing. Sometimes the loneliness settled in around the edges, on birthdays, in the quiet hours after work, when I caught the scent of the same perfume my mother used to wear on a passing stranger. But I didn't let it hollow me out. I painted, I sketched, I took long walks without headphones, listening to the rhythm of a city that didn't know my name but still let me exist. And little by little, I started to take up space again. I hung my first piece in the gallery's back room, just a small watercolor, unsigned. No one knew it was mine except the curator, who nodded once and said, "You've got something." That was enough. I received an invitation that winter, a gala hosted by the Matthews Family Foundation. I stared at the envelope for a long time, the gold script of my name unfamiliar in its formality. Inside, a note, "You're always welcome. Warmly, Vanessa." There was no mention of the will, of the house, of the years erased. Just that cold, practiced warmth she was so good at performing. I didn't go. I didn't need to. I didn't need to see Juliet in another borrowed gown, or watch Vanessa float through rooms like she hadn't rewritten my place in the family. I didn't need to hear polite applause from strangers who never asked where I'd gone. I stayed home that night, made myself dinner, lit a candle, and painted in silence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because someone said I was, but because I decided I didn't need anyone to confirm it. Everything I had built. No favors, no shortcuts, no validation, just me. And for now, that was enough. It was a Tuesday in April, the kind of day where the rain didn't fall in sheets, but in soft, indecisive drizzles that turned the sidewalks to watercolor. The gallery was quiet. Just me, a half-unpacked shipment of sculptures, and the low hum of jazz drifting from the speakers. I remember wiping down the glass display when I first heard the door open. A man stepped inside, tall, a little rain-damp, his jacket unbuttoned like he hadn't planned to be anywhere in particular. He wandered slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes lingering on a small collection of abstract canvases near the window. I walked over, not expecting anything more than a polite exchange. "Can I help you find something specific?" I asked. He turned, smiled, and said, "Just browsing. But I'm curious about this artist. What's her story?" He was pointing to a series by Lucia Mendes, a young painter exploring themes of urban isolation. I told him about her use of negative space, how she painted silence without painting anything at all. He listened, not the way most visitors did, nodding politely while thinking about dinner plans, but really listened. Like the story behind each piece mattered as much as the price tag beneath it. We talked for almost an hour. When he finally handed me his business card, I didn't expect the name Ethan Lawson, CEO of Lawson Technologies. I'd seen the name in headlines, on the cover of Forbes, whispered about in the business pages I rarely read. But that afternoon, he was just a man in a button-down shirt asking genuine questions about a struggling artist's brushstrokes. Our first coffee happened later that week. It turned into dinner when neither of us noticed the cafe closing around us. He told me about growing up in Seattle. His parents were both teachers, more likely to quote poetry than profit margins. They thought I was crazy to leave grad school and start my company. He laughed. But they sent care packages anyway. Granola, notes, encouragement. I told him about the gallery, about my apartment above the bookstore, about how sometimes I painted just to remember how it felt to exist without performance. I didn't talk about Vanessa, or Juliet, or the will. Not yet. He didn't rush me. Ethan showed up with lunch on gallery days, suggested quiet bookstores instead of loud restaurants. He never once talked about his net worth, his company, or the people who constantly sought his time. When I finally asked why he lived in a modest brownstone and drove a 10-year-old car, he shrugged. "Money's not the problem, but people start believing they are their money. That scares me." I found myself telling him things I hadn't said aloud in years. About the room I lost, the father who disappeared inside his own silence, the slow exile from a home that once held my name on the mailbox. One night, on his rooftop, the city blinking beneath us, he asked softly, "You never talk about your family. What happened?" So I told him. All of it. Not as a confession, not for sympathy, just as truth. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. When I finished, he didn't offer pity or solutions. He simply reached for my hand and said, "They failed you, Claire, not the other way around." That sentence landed somewhere deep, in a place that had long believed I was hard to love. And from that moment, something began to shift. We spent a year building something quiet, steady. I met his family. His mother made the best lemon shortbread I'd ever had, and his sister Lily once drove across state lines just to help me hang a gallery piece that wouldn't sit straight. They welcomed me without hesitation, not because I was impressive, but because I mattered. A year after that rainy Tuesday, Ethan and I walked along the edge of Lake Michigan. The sky stretched open above us. He stopped suddenly, took both my hands, and looked at me like the world had stilled. "I love you," he said. "Not for what you've survived, but for how you stayed soft anyway. For the way you see beauty, even in broken things. Build a life with me." There was no ring yet, no grand gesture, just the steady presence of someone who saw me clearly and chose me. Not in spite of my past, but with it. And for the first time in a long time, I believed I was worth choosing. We were married on a quiet Saturday afternoon, beneath a cluster of maple trees in Ethan's parents' backyard in Seattle. The ceremony was small, 30 guests, all people who had shown up for us in real ways, not just on calendars. There were no choreographed speeches, no media announcements, no society photographers waiting outside the gates, just sunlight, laughter, and the steady hum of something real. I wore a simple dress, ivory silk, no train. Ethan wore a navy suit, his mother's cufflinks, and a look I would remember for the rest of my life. When we said our vows, it wasn't about promises we thought we had to make. It was about the ones we had already lived, quietly, day by day. No one from my father's side attended. They didn't know. They hadn't asked. And I hadn't told them. It wasn't secrecy. It was self-protection. After the wedding, we moved back to Illinois and settled in Silverfield, a quiet suburb with wide streets and neighbors who waved without asking too many questions. Our home was modest but warm. Ethan kept his home office in the back sunroom. I filled the walls with sketches from the gallery. We bought secondhand furniture, hosted slow Sunday dinners, and planted herbs in mismatched pots on the windowsill. I kept my job at Whitestone Gallery, refused Ethan's gentle suggestions to take some time off, or maybe start your own space. I wasn't stubborn. I was rooted. The gallery was more than a paycheck. It was the place I had first felt seen, first felt worthy on my own terms. That mattered to me. Every morning, I took the train into the city, coffee in one hand, sketchpad in the other. No one in the office cared who my husband was, and I liked it that way. We never posted wedding photos online, not out of shame, just preference. Ethan, despite his public status, valued privacy as fiercely as I did. Our life existed offline, in morning walks, in shared grocery lists, in notes left on the fridge when one of us had to leave early. Occasionally, a glossy magazine would name Ethan one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors. Outdated content recycled for clicks. I never corrected them. I never needed to. He wasn't anyone's headline. He was mine. The gallery staff knew me as Claire Whitmore. I kept my maiden name professionally, partly for continuity, mostly because it still belonged to my mother, the last real connection to a version of family that once felt whole. Vanessa and Juliet never reached out. No word, no invitation, no belated congratulations. I sometimes wondered if they even knew I was married, if they had seen Ethan's name in an article and put the pieces together. But even if they had, it didn't matter. They no longer held power over how I measured my joy. For the first time in years, I woke each morning without the heaviness of being forgotten. I didn't live to prove anything. I wasn't seeking recognition from a family that had once looked through me like glass. Instead, I cooked dinners with a man who remembered how I liked my tea. I answered emails about local artists trying to break through. I painted again, not for a gallery wall, but for myself. This wasn't a grand reinvention. It was a quiet reclamation of space, of choice, of the kind of life that didn't require a last name to have value. No one needed to know we were happy, except us, and that was more than enough. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utilities bill and a flyer for roof repair. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with gold-embossed lettering that curled around my name like it belonged to someone else. Claire Whitmore. Not Claire Reed, not Mrs. Lawson, just the girl they remembered, if they remembered me at all. Inside was an invitation to the annual Mercy Children's Foundation Gala, held at the Langford Grand in downtown Chicago. Vanessa Carrington's name appeared at the bottom in flowing ink, beneath the words "Event Chair." A handwritten note was clipped to the top corner. "Claire, it's been too long. The family misses you. We should reconnect." Warmly, Vanessa. There was no apology, no mention of the years that had passed in cold silence, no acknowledgement of the girl she once asked to find her own place in the world, then never looked back to see where she'd gone. Just a smile in cursive, and the familiar weight of a woman who had mastered the art of rewriting memory. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers unmoving, the kitchen clock ticking behind me like it was trying to make a decision on my behalf. That evening, I left it on the counter, untouched. Ethan noticed it as soon as he walked in, his hand still holding a grocery bag. "What's that?" I said nothing. Just pushed the envelope toward him. He opened it, scanned the contents once, then again, his brow furrowing slightly. "Mercy Children's Gala," he said, then paused. "Vanessa is chairing this." I nodded slowly. "Apparently. They miss me." He was quiet for a beat. "Claire, this is the event the Lawson Foundation is sponsoring this year. We're the primary donor." I blinked. "You're funding her event." He ran a hand through his hair, then set the grocery bag down. I didn't realize she was involved. "My team handles the logistics. We approve major grants. But the gala itself is part of a broader initiative with the hospital." Everything was listed under the foundation's name. No personal details. It made sense. Ethan never micromanaged. His trust in people was something I'd always admired. But now, that trust had accidentally tied us to a night I never planned to attend. "She must have found out about us," I said quietly. "There's no other reason she'd reach out." He nodded. "It's possible. Your names appeared in the papers occasionally. Features about gallery openings, interviews. And we've been in a few society pages together. Someone probably put it together." I picked up the envelope again, letting my thumb trace the raised lettering. Part of me wanted to throw it out, to reject, with finality, the version of family that had only ever remembered me when it served a purpose. But another part, the stronger one, felt something shift. "What if I go?" I asked. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Are you sure?" "No," I admitted. "But maybe it's time. Not for them, for me." He moved closer, resting his hand gently on my back. "Then we go together." I shook my head. "No, I think I need to walk in alone first. Let them see who I've become, not who they remember." He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll come later. We'll make it look unplanned. Let the moment happen on its own." I felt the corners of my mouth lift, not in amusement, but in clarity. They still think they know who I am. "Let them learn," Ethan said, that night. As we sat on the porch watching the wind shift the trees, I imagined myself walking into that ballroom, not with anger, not with revenge, just with presence, undeniable, unapologetic, whole. I wasn't going to remind them who I was. I was going to show them who I'd become. The Langford Grand shimmered under its chandeliers the night I arrived. The valet line stretched around the block, a parade of luxury sedans and designer gowns. I stepped out of my rideshare alone, clutching a midnight blue clutch that matched the soft satin of my gown. Simple, elegant, not loud, just enough to be noticed without begging for attention. Inside, the ballroom sparkled. Tall glass centerpieces reflected candlelight, and a string quartet played near the grand staircase. I gave my name at the check-in table. The young woman scanned the list and smiled. "Claire Whitmore." "Yes. Welcome. Enjoy the evening." I walked in, shoulders back, heart steady. The room was already thick with Chicago's elite. Investors, board members, philanthropists. Faces I remembered from my childhood only slightly altered by time and money. I nodded politely at a few distant relatives who squinted as if trying to place me, then quickly turned away. No one offered a greeting. Vanessa stood near the main stage, flanked by Juliet and two hospital directors. She wore crimson, strategic, commanding. Her laughter floated easily through the room, her posture relaxed, confident. Juliet, now 28 but dressed like she had never aged past prom season, noticed me first. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. She leaned toward Vanessa and whispered something behind the rim of her champagne glass. Vanessa turned. Our eyes met, and in that brief second, something cold flickered behind her smile. But then she lifted her glass and walked toward the stage. The band quieted as she stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began. Thank you all for being here tonight in support of the Mercy Children's Foundation. We are honored to host this evening on behalf of the families we serve and the futures we believe in. There was polite applause. I stood near the perimeter of the room, listening. Then her tone changed. Light, teasing. And of course, our deepest thanks to all of the staff working behind the scenes, especially those who arrived early, even in evening wear, to ensure everything ran smoothly. Her eyes flicked directly to me. There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter. A few heads turned. She continued, voice syrupy. Sometimes we all forget our place in the flurry of the evening. One of our servers appears to have joined the guests a bit prematurely. Bless her heart. The blood drained from my face. Murmurs started. I could feel eyes on my gown, on my hands, on my stillness. Then Juliet stepped forward, phone in hand, camera rolling. Maybe she just wanted a taste of the high life, she said with a smirk. Let's not judge. Aspirations are healthy. More laughter. Looser now. People relaxed into it, mistaking cruelty for charm. Vanessa gestured toward the nearest security guard. Excuse me, she said, as if she were saving the event from inconvenience. Would you please escort our helper to the correct entrance or perhaps out entirely, if she's not actually on staff? The man, tall, dark suit, earpiece, looked at me, uncertain. I was invited, I said, voice even. I'm sure it was a mix-up. Vanessa cut in quickly. We often send courtesy copies to extended connections. I'm afraid Miss Whitmore misunderstood. I could barely breathe. Around me, relatives stood in silence. Uncle Henry, who once held me on his shoulders, Cousin Alice, who'd braided my hair at family picnics. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The security guard approached gently. Ma'am, would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment? Juliet kept filming. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. Not here. Not for them. As I turned toward the exit, I caught one final remark from Vanessa, tossed lightly over her shoulder for the crowd. It's always been this way with Claire. She has a history of inserting herself where she doesn't belong. The laughter returned, but I kept walking, one step at a time, each footfall heavier than the last, until the ballroom doors stood just feet ahead, waiting to swallow me whole. I was 3 steps from the ballroom doors when they opened. The room shifted, conversations faltered, and then, in the hush that followed, Ethan walked in. He didn't rush. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there for a moment, tall in his black tuxedo, the quiet weight of presence settling over the crowd like gravity. The crystal lights above caught the edge of his cufflinks as he moved, steady, intentional, across the polished floor. I felt the security guard pause beside me. Juliet's phone wavered in her hand. Vanessa, still on stage, faltered mid-sentence as she caught sight of him. Claire, Ethan said, voice even but unmistakably clear. Dozens of heads turned toward me, and then toward him, and back again. He reached my side, gently touching my arm. Are you all right? He asked, like the rest of the room didn't exist. Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped forward, smile fixed but voice thinner now. Mr. Lawson, what a surprise. I didn't know you were attending. Ethan didn't smile. I'm not here as a guest, he said. I'm here because someone thought it was appropriate to publicly humiliate my wife. The word landed like a stone in still water. Wife. The murmurs began almost immediately. The people who had whispered and laughed minutes earlier now looked between us with dawning recognition. Juliet's mouth opened, then closed again, the camera in her hand slowly lowering. Vanessa's face went pale. Your wife, she repeated, her voice catching. Ethan nodded. Claire and I have been married for 2 years. We chose to keep it private, for reasons that, clearly, now make sense. He turned to the crowd, not angry, not loud, just deliberate. I understand this evening is being hosted in partnership with Mercy Children's Foundation. What many of you may not know is that the Lawson Foundation is the anonymous donor funding tonight's gala. And what I've witnessed here has given me reason to reconsider that support. Gasps echoed around us. Even the band had gone silent. Vanessa tried to recover. Mr. Lawson, surely there's been a misunderstanding. We had no idea. If we had known. Ethan's gaze sharpened. That's exactly the problem. My wife's value in this room shouldn't depend on who she married or what I fund. But apparently, in your version of family, dignity is conditional. Juliet stepped forward, voice syrupy and strained. Claire, why didn't you tell us we would have? He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. You filmed her, he said calmly, eyes on Juliet. You mocked her, publicly, surrounded by people who once claimed to love her. She flushed, shrinking slightly beneath the weight of his composure. Vanessa tried again, her voice breaking at the edges. Let's not make a scene. We're all family here. No, Claire said, my voice, finally steady. We're not. I turned toward the security guard who had tried to usher me out. Thank you for doing your job, I said gently. You were following instructions, but I'll be staying. He nodded, stepping back. Ethan looked at me then, his hand finding mine. We can leave if you want, he whispered. You don't owe anyone here a second more. I shook my head. No, I'm not leaving in shame. And just like that, the power shifted, not with shouting, not with vengeance, just with truth, spoken plainly in a room that had only ever offered silence. The silence after Ethan's words lingered, thick and undeniable. You could hear the clink of a single fork against porcelain somewhere across the ballroom. But no one moved. No one laughed. The audience that had once found amusement in my humiliation now watched with a discomfort they couldn't quite disguise. Vanessa stood frozen, lips parted, 1,000 rehearsed phrases lost somewhere between pride and panic. Juliet took a slow step back, fingers tightening around the phone she no longer dared raise. Ethan's voice remained calm. The Lawson Foundation will continue to support Mercy Children's, he said, glancing toward the hospital's director. But effective immediately, we'll be requesting a restructuring of the gala committee. Moving forward, this event should reflect the values it claims to represent. He didn't need to say Vanessa's name. The meaning was clear. Across the room, a few heads nodded, some out of agreement, others out of self-preservation. The hospital's director, a woman named Evelyn Monroe whom I had met once briefly at a past gallery event, stepped forward and cleared her throat. We appreciate your transparency, Mr. Lawson, and your generosity. We'll be in touch regarding next steps. Vanessa's composure cracked, but she said nothing. She didn't protest. She didn't apologize. She simply folded her hands, like someone bracing for a storm they couldn't control. One by one, guests began to approach me, those same family acquaintances who had watched earlier with smirks or indifference. They now wore polite smiles, offering words that sounded like olive branches but carried the weight of convenience. Claire, you've grown into such a poised young woman. We had no idea you were married to Mr. Lawson. Congratulations. I always admired your independence, you know, even back when… I nodded, said thank you, accepted their hollow words with a grace they had never shown me. But I didn't let them in, because they weren't apologizing for what they'd done. They were apologizing for getting caught. I made my way through the ballroom with Ethan beside me. My dress, the one Juliet had mocked as off the rack, now drew quiet admiration. My posture, once ignored, now turned heads. But I wasn't walking for them. I wasn't reclaiming space because they suddenly saw me. I was simply taking back what had always been mine. No revenge, no spectacle, just presence. We reached our assigned table, ironically placed at the front of the room, a position reserved for the event's most distinguished guests. The place cards had already been printed Ethan Lawson, Claire Whitmore. For all their attempts to erase me, my name had been there all along, waiting for me to return. Dinner resumed. The quartet picked up where they had left off. The rhythm of the evening tried to reassemble itself, but the tone had changed. The air held a different weight now. Vanessa stayed near the back, her wine untouched. Juliet hovered at her side, still watching us, but no longer recording. I leaned toward Ethan. We could leave, if you'd rather. He looked at me, then at the room that had once turned its back on me. Only if you want to. I paused, then shook my head. No, I think I'd like to stay, for once. I'm here on my own terms. He smiled, lifting his glass. To that, Mrs. Whitmore Lawson. I clinked mine gently against his, feeling something settle in me, not pride, not vindication, just peace. I didn't need applause. I didn't need acknowledgement. All I needed was this to be exactly where I stood, seen clearly, and unshaken. The days after the gala unfolded like the quiet after a long storm. Emails began trickling in, first from distant cousins, then from people I barely remembered sharing holiday dinners with. They were polite, cautious, each one echoing the same rehearsed tone. You were always so strong. Claire, I'm sorry if things were ever misunderstood. We'd love to catch up sometime soon. But I didn't answer. Not because I was angry. Because I was done performing for people who only saw my worth after someone else affirmed it. Flowers arrived at the gallery. An enormous bouquet with a note from Uncle Henry. Family above all. I gave the arrangement to the children's ward at the hospital down the street. Let something bright grow where it might actually mean something. Then, 3 days after the gala, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Just my name on the envelope in looping cursive I hadn't seen in years. Claire, I don't expect forgiveness, but I would be grateful for a conversation. Charlotte, Aunt Charlotte, my father's younger sister, the one who had never been cruel, but never quite brave, either. She had kept her distance after my mother died, always quiet at family events, always standing just outside the circle of drama. We met at a quiet cafe near the gallery, tucked into a street lined with sycamores. She looked older than I remembered, softer around the edges, like time had gently worn down the sharpness. Her hands shook slightly when she lifted her teacup. Thank you for coming, she said. I nodded. You asked honestly, that's rare. We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again. I owe you the truth. Claire, not the one the family passed around like gossip, but the one I should have told you a long time ago. I waited. She set her cup down. After your mother passed, your father fell apart in a way none of us knew how to help. Vanessa was efficient. She stepped in and made everything look whole again. But inside, he was grieving, and confused, and tired. She paused, eyes glistening. I knew what she was doing. I watched her rewrite the story. Make you seem difficult, distant. I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my place, that he would see through it eventually. But by the time he tried, it was too late. I said nothing, but something in me shifted. Did he really believe I didn't need him? I asked quietly. Charlotte shook her head. No, not for a second. He kept pictures of you, in his office at work, not at home. Vanessa didn't like them on the shelves, but he kept one in his desk drawer, another behind a framed certificate. I saw them, every time I visited. I closed my eyes for a moment. It wasn't a fix. It didn't undo the choices he'd made. But it was something, a thread of truth I hadn't known I needed. I think he was ashamed, she added. Ashamed that he hadn't protected you better, and he didn't know how to come back from that. We sat there for almost 2 hours, talking about my mother, about how I used to dance in the kitchen in socks too big, about how Robert, for all his brilliance in business, was deeply afraid of emotional failure. When we parted, Charlotte didn't ask for reconciliation. She didn't beg for a second chance. She just said, I see you now. Claire, I should have seen you sooner. And for the first time in years, I believed someone meant it. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn evening in Silverfield, we launched the Thomas Whitmore Art Therapy Foundation. It wasn't a black tie gala or a red carpet affair, just a warm gathering under golden string lights. In the converted loft space of the Whitestone Gallery, paintings from children's workshops lined the walls, bright colors, bold brushstrokes, stories told without words. Ethan stood beside me, one hand resting gently at my back. Charlotte was there too, along with a few close friends, several hospital therapists, and a quiet audience of people who believed that healing didn't always begin in hospitals, but sometimes in color, in clay, in creation. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward slowly. No podium, no cue cards, just me, a microphone, and the weight of everything I had carried. I was once a child who stopped speaking when I realized no one was listening. I began. But art gave me another language. It gave me room to be angry, to grieve, to exist. I looked around the room, not for approval, but to connect. Grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's a door closed too early, or a voice you stop using because no one calls your name. I created this foundation not because I wanted to erase my past, but because I needed to give it shape, meaning, and because every child deserves the chance to process their pain in a way that makes them feel powerful again. The room was quiet, not tense, just still, present. I named this foundation after my father, I said, my voice softer. Not because he got everything right, but because I believe, in his own quiet way, he would have wanted this, a legacy that speaks through compassion, not control. Later, as the event wound down, someone asked me why I hadn't included the Whitmore family in the press release. I smiled, not out of bitterness, just clarity. Because the family I'm honoring tonight isn't the one I came from, I said. It's the one I've built. Ethan reached for my hand as we walked home under a sky washed in amber. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be invited in. I was already home, because family, I'd learned, is not where you're accepted when you're successful. It's who still sees your worth when you're not. I used to think family was something you had to earn your way back into. Now I know. Real family doesn't ask you to shrink. I didn't return to prove anything. I returned to reclaim what was mine, with grace, not noise. If you've ever rebuilt yourself in silence, or found strength in being overlooked, drop a comment. And if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing. Sometimes, dignity is the loudest thing you never have to say out loud.